Hello, everyone, and welcome to We the People Means All the People, a webinar on voting rights and using business power to advocate against voter suppression. My name is Marielle Martin, and I am the Racial Equity Program Manager for B Lab U.S. in Canada. We're starting today's event with a land acknowledgement. The land I live on is Lenni Lenape land, known today as Philadelphia. You can use the link provided in the chat to learn more about the land that you reside on. We also want to review the code of ethics for today for our guests. B Lab U.S. in Canada stands against all forms of racism and all forms of oppression. Our company will respond appropriately to any behaviors that do not align with the values outlined above in our code of ethics, including asking attendees to leave. If you're being harassed, notice that someone else is being harassed, or have any other concerns, please notify us during the event or email events@bcorporation.net. Today's event is full of great speakers and exciting content. We will start with an introduction from Next Philadelphia, an introduction from Southern Poverty Law Center and ACLU. We'll then go into the history of voting rights in the U.S., federal voter suppression, state level voter suppression, and how businesses can advocate. Later on, we'll have a B Corp panel featuring Amalgamated Bank, Ben & Jerry's, and Chicory Wealth. And at the end, we'll go over what businesses can do beyond this event, our next steps, and adjourn. I will now pass it to Latoya Ritchie to introduce herself, the National Urban League, and Next Philadelphia.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marielle, for that introduction. I really appreciate this event, and thank you, B Lab, for including us this afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Latoya Ritchie, and I am president with Next Philadelphia, the Young Professionals chapter of the Urban League of Philadelphia. Just wanted to give you guys a brief history of the National Urban League. The National Urban League is one of the nation's oldest civil rights organization, and we're dedicated to ensuring that Black and Brown people have their highest social parity, economic self-reliance, power, and civil rights. Within the National Urban League are affiliate chapters across the country, and the Urban League of Philadelphia is one of those affiliate chapters. The Urban League of Philadelphia supports the mission and the movement of the National Urban League, including advocacy and policy, business and talent diversity, as well as community and economic development. Where Next Philadelphia comes into play is we are one of the National Urban League Young Professionals chapter, which also exists among the affiliates. We ensure that the nation's next leadership of millennials, folks from the age of 18 to 40-ish, are available to continue the mission of the National Urban League. We have chapters across the country in different cities as well. But here in Next Philadelphia, we are making sure that the needs of our community in the city of Philadelphia are met. Of course, this conversation is about voting rights, and we are all here to make sure folks are aware of why voting is important. We support mentoring the youth to ensure they're involved quicker than later so they know how important their voice is. Again, I wanted to thank you guys for having us today, and I'm looking forward to the program. I'll pass it over to Danielle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Latoya and Mari. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Danielle Silber. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Corporate Engagement Director for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and I am speaking from Muncie Lenape land in New York. I love the title of this presentation, partially because the ACLU's tagline is also that we the people means all of us. The ACLU is in every single state, including Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., fighting for all civil liberties that are entrusted by the Constitution, including racial justice, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, reproductive freedom, immigrants' rights, freedom from criminalization, and so much more. So really grateful to be here today. The other tiny bit of backdrop that I want to share is one of the reasons that we created this presentation in partnership with B Lab and the Southern Poverty Law Center today is that for the past 6 years now, we've been working with the private sector to provide presentations and background on the inextricability of racial justice and voting rights, because we saw so many companies doing wonderful GOTV, get out the vote work, but without acknowledging the systemic barriers to accessing the polls that is designed to make it harder, especially for people of color, to cast a ballot. We felt like it was really important for companies to acknowledge this background and to do what they can, in addition to helping people to get out the vote, to address these systemic barriers through advocacy and other means. So really grateful for this presentation coming into being. And with that, I will pass it to my fantastic colleague, LaShawn Warren.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I am LaShawn Warren, the Chief Policy Officer for the Southern Poverty Law Center. So a bit about our organization. We have a presence in 5 different states, in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Our organization is a public interest organization, and we focus on addressing issues around racism and combating racism in our country. We have 4 different impact goals where we have focused quite a bit of our resources and efforts. The first one, which is one that we're most known for, which is combating hate and white supremacy throughout the country. We also have a specialty in focusing on expanding our democracy. So we have a voting rights litigation team and have a pretty robust advocacy efforts in that arena. We also have an eradicating poverty issue area where we work, and then decarceration of Black and brown bodies, which includes immigration. So we're delighted to be here and delighted to be a part of this particular conversation. Just a note about me, I actually was a part of the strategy team to get the Voting Rights Act reauthorized the last time it was reauthorized, which was in 2006. So we're delighted to share our insight and our learnings with you today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Mari.
Thank you, LaShawn. And really quickly before we get started, I just want to ground us in B Lab's global vision. So B Lab's global vision is one of inclusive, equitable, and regenerative economic system for all people on the planet. But to make that a reality, we must center dismantling racism, which is one of the most pressing challenges our society faces today. B Lab U.S. and Canada defines racial equity as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all people, immaterial of their race or ethnicity, can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. In the US and Canada, racial inequity is largely perpetuated by structural racism. And structural racism refers to historical and ongoing political, cultural, social, and economic policies and practices that systematically disadvantage people of color, and especially the Black community disproportionately. B Corp currently has 2,000 plus US and Canada-based B Corps that have the power to move the needle on racial equity. We also focus on the intersectionality between the current climate crisis and racial inequity. It's not B Lab's role to be the leaders on all of these topics, but to find the right partners to provide our B Corps with the tools to become leaders themselves. We will continue to partner with expert organizations like the National Urban League, ACLU, and Southern Poverty Law Center on issues like voting rights to educate our B Corps and hopefully inspire you into action. And with that, I'll pass it over to our experts for today, and over to you, LaShawn.
Thank you, Mari. Thank you, Mari. So just a word about the history of voting in this country. The United States has a long history of voting discrimination against Black and brown people. As a matter of fact, if you look at our history, the right to vote and who may exercise it has been and remains a consistent and continuous struggle. When we consider the constitutional amendments like the 15th Amendment that barred race from consideration from voting, when we look at the 19th Amendment that barred gender from consideration for voting, the 24th dealing with taxes, poll taxes, the 26th Amendment dealing with age. We can acknowledge that there has been a constant and ongoing struggle to ensure that we have a democratic government that's representative of all the people. And so where are we in this process? So if we go to today, there are still efforts, despite there being some progress, there are still efforts to suppress voter participation, particularly among communities of color, and that has not abated. And while we have had successes like the Voting Rights Act, and Danielle will talk a little bit more about that history, they have been followed by periods of regression, such as the devastating Supreme Court decision in 2013, the Shelby County versus Holder decision, which significantly weakened the Voting Rights Act, which is really a critical tool for us to address discrimination, primarily in states that have a history of discrimination against Black and Brown people. All of this coincides, all of these efforts to roll back voting rights coincides with the growing diversity of this country, and that cannot be lost with respect to this particular conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Danielle to talk a little bit more about the history of voting rights and how we got here.
Thank you, LaShawn. So just a visual for you all, I think a lot of times Americans forget that it took a long time for many Americans to actually have access to the ballot and have legal protections for voting rights. So for example, as LaShawn mentioned, African-American men weren't granted the right to vote until the 15th Amendment essentially was passed. And then you can look at this list: Native American women, not until 1920, Native American people, not until 1924, and so on. For the purposes of this presentation, I want to ground us specifically in the theme or the frame that LaShawn just provided in terms of when this country has done the right thing and granted inclusive access to the ballot. There are often times of social regression or cultural regression and movements, especially white supremacist movements, to make it harder for the people who just won the rights to vote or should have the right to vote to be able to vote. And so one specific historic example that is reflective of what happened across the American South is right after Reconstruction. There was a huge rise in Black people registering and voting and entering into office across the American South. And then because of the rise of the KKK, terrorism of Black communities, and the introduction of voter suppression laws, we saw a dramatic decrease, almost to no voter registration, let alone Black people voting across the South. And so this one graph from Louisiana is just one example of how within the span of 2 years, because of this rise of violence, we saw just the absolute diminishing of Black voter registration and turnout. And I also want to call attention to this graph and to an upcoming story or example, because we oftentimes think about what's happening in modern day without reflecting back on history. And so when we think about the increasing violence at the polls, the increased threatening of poll workers, intimidation of poll workers and other election officials, it's important to reflect back. This isn't the first time that we've seen this, and the root cause, at least in history, and I would argue continuing today, is a white supremacist movement to make it harder for people of color in particular to vote. Slide. So one specific example that I thought would be powerful to share today is in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a interracial city alderman. So there were almost equal amount of Black representatives and white representatives. And at the time, there was a Black newspaper that published a retort to a insidious opinion piece that had been published across the South that was incredibly racist and incendiary. And in response to that piece, there was a white mob that emerged that not only burned down the city's Black newspaper, but they also terrorized the Black aldermen, killed as many as 250 people, especially Black men, and reinstated unelected white people into office. This is considered the only successful American coup d'etat in our nation's history. And the reason that this story is so important is this is the type of thing that happened across the American South in 1898 and the late 1890s, which ended Reconstruction essentially and made it possible for widespread voter suppression across the American South and spreading into other states across the country. Slide. Decades of struggle ensued, and the Black community in particular led incredible civil fights in order to fight to return the rights of voting rights and other civil rights. And all of this amounted to the first Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first major civil rights legislation since the end of Reconstruction. And in this piece of legislation, it was the first time that there was a civil rights section of the Justice Department that was created to empower the federal government to forcefully ensure voting rights. The problem that they found is that even after they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, most of the measures under the law allowed the federal government to chase after bad actors and to chase after a state that passed voter suppression law or was making it harder for Black people to vote. And so it wasn't until, slide please, the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was signed into law by President Johnson that included a prophylactic measure. So it essentially looked at all of the states that historically had suppressed Black voters and said, if you want to change any of your voting policies, you actually have to run those policies by the federal government, by the Justice Department, to ensure that those policies aren't racially discriminatory. And this piece of legislation was incredibly effective for that prophylactic reason. Slide, please. And it had incredible bipartisan support. So the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized under several administrations, all of which were Republican. And so in 1982, President Reagan reauthorized, and then slide. And you'll see that under the Voting Rights Act, it was so successful that just like we saw this steep decline after Reconstruction of Black people being able to access the ballot, because of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, we see a steep incline in Black voters being able to register, and we know also able to vote. Slide, please. And so again, in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized by George W. Bush, and the corporate community actually played a significant role in helping to endorse the Voting Rights Act reauthorization, and it passed almost unanimously in Congress by both parties. It's also worth noting that as our country had evolved, the types of voter discrimination and voter suppression laws had also evolved. So this reauthorization also included other forms of racial discrimination. So it looked at states like Arizona that had discriminated against Latinx populations. And it also looked at other forms of discrimination like people who speak English as a second language and ways that the franchise could discriminate against people based on language. Slide. And then in 2008, we saw a record number turnout of voters in this country. We also, as LaShawn alluded to, saw the most diverse electorate in American history. And whereas one would think that legislators, policymakers, people who believe in democracy would have celebrated that we finally had such tremendous voter turnout, instead, after 2008, we saw many states across the country introduce and pass voter suppression laws. Still, however, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, all of those states, or I should say all the states in the South that had a record of racial discrimination when it came to voting rights, had to pass their laws by the Justice Department. So it was somewhat possible for organizations like SPLC, ACLU, the Legal Defense Fund to challenge those laws. However, slide. Let me give you an example of one of these laws. So for example, the types of laws that were being introduced were so clearly racially discriminatory. This example of a voter ID law in North Carolina, you can see that a representative literally looked into if they were to discount student voter IDs from the university, the North Carolina university system, would that negatively impact Black voters enough, or would that would that have a high impact on Black voters to make it make it easier for the white electorate to vote in the people who they wanted to vote in. So this example, the ACLU was able to win this case. The judge even said it was so clear that this law, this voting ID law, was introduced with surgical precision to discount and to remove the Black electorate from the state. And so we won in this example. However, slide, as LaShawn alluded to earlier, in 2013, the Supreme Court saw one of these questions about the Voting Rights Act, because these states, at the same time that they were trying to pass the Voting Rights Act, every time those new voter repression policies were struck down, they were litigating them to try and undermine the Voting Rights Act. And so in 2013, the Supreme Court guts that part of the Voting Rights Act that made it essential for any state to pass any of their new voter laws by the Justice Department. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said that throwing out this preclearance clause in the Voting Rights Act, because we weren't seeing a big problem with racial discrimination in voting, is like going into a rainstorm with an umbrella and throwing away your umbrella because you're not getting wet. And so essentially this decision, Shelby County versus Holder, part of the decision was the thinking that we were in a post-racial society and the Voting Rights Act had already done its job. Sadly, we all know we are not in a post-racial society. We are still facing, as a nation, incredible racial discrimination. And so our organizations continue to fight for voting rights despite this decision. Slide. I should flag that voter suppression policies don't only impact Black people or Latinx people. It's not only racial discriminatory, either by design or by default. There are other populations that are also driven from the polls, or it makes them harder to vote. So in particular, students. One example in Texas, you can't vote with your student ID, but you can vote with your gun ID. This is also, these laws are by design undermine the ability for Indigenous people to vote. It makes many of these laws make it harder for people with disabilities to vote, and also make it harder for people who are trans to vote. Slide, please. Knowing that we want to root this conversation specifically also in racial justice, it's really important to note that across this country, one, we know, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, that Black and Brown people are pushed way disproportionately into the criminal legal system. And if you look at this map, it's also clear that almost every state in the country makes it impossible for people who are either in jail or prison to vote, or people who are even out of jail and prison have done their parole. Many states also continue to make it illegal for people who are formally incarcerated to ever vote. And to root this again in history, looking at even just the example of Florida, it's very clear that after the 13th Amendment was passed and slavery was forbidden, except for people who were incarcerated, soon after the 15th Amendment was passed that made it possible for African-American men to vote, shortly thereafter, the Florida state passed a law saying that anyone who had ever been incarcerated could never vote again in their life in the state of Florida. So we can see the direct correlation or causation, I should say, of the lawmakers at the time, and sadly, I would argue into today, that are trying to make it impossible for Black people to vote. Slide. And with that, I will turn it over to LaShawn to bring us up to more current day.
Thank you, Danielle. So that was very helpful context. And so where are we now in 2022? Well, we are reeling quite a bit from the devastating impact of COVID. But one of the things that COVID did do, it presented an opportunity for election administration officials to make voting more accessible to people. And that's precisely what they did. You saw that there was quite a bit in the 2020 election, there was quite a bit of use of mail-in ballots, and people who would not otherwise have an opportunity to vote were able to do so. And as a result of that, we saw the highest voter turnout in the 21st century, with 66.8% of citizens voting. Now that number sounds low, but it's good for the United States. And we really are trying to get more people invested in civic participation and out to vote and make their voices heard. Well, that victory, instead of celebrating, as Danielle said, we had a number of states, particularly those in the South, who immediately began to introduce laws to make it a lot more difficult for people to vote. In fact, since the beginning of 2021, 18 states have passed 34 restrictive voting laws, which make it much more difficult to vote, particularly for communities of color. Next slide. January 6th. So January 6th for us was a real inflection point in our country and deeply unsettling. And we consider what happened in January 6th to be akin to the historical account that Danielle laid out that happened in Wilmington in 1898. It is a reminder that we must fight not only to maintain our democracy, but also to ensure that voting is accessible to everyone, regardless of their color or ethnicity or the language that they speak. Next slide, please. So what is the solution? One of the things that we have been doing as a civil rights community, and we've been partnering with private entities as well, we've been working to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act with hopefully the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Danielle talked a little bit about why Section 5 is so important, but let me just kind of back up and say the 2013 Shelby County case was not the first time that Section 5 was challenged. Immediately after the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2006. In 2009, there was an effort out of Texas by utility district, the Northwest Municipal Utility District, that tried to challenge the constitutionality of Section 5. And it did not work. And then several years later, in 2013, we ended up with Shelby County, which really undermined Section 5. And you'll hear us talk about Section 5 being the crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act. And the reason why, as Danielle alluded to, this particular piece of legislation, it acts unlike any other civil rights legislation. And the reason why is because it tries to get out ahead of the discrimination before it happens. It is prophylactic, as she mentioned. And what that means is before the discrimination can take place, there is an assessment about whether photo ID requirements, for example, will have a discriminatory effect against the Latino community or the Black community. If a jurisdiction is closing polling places in particular areas, will that have a discriminatory impact on Black communities? And we saw after Section 5 was eliminated as a result of the use of Section 5 was eliminated after 2013, one of the things that we saw was that there was a number of jurisdictions across the South that were closing polling places in predominantly Black communities. This is, Georgia was an example, Texas was an example. We saw all kinds of changes with respect to absentee ballots and the use, the timing of early voting, when voting ended. All of those things have been changed systemically and systematically in order to limit the participation of particular communities. And so without Section 5 being operable, there are very few tools that we have at our disposal to address some of the issues that we're seeing moving forward. And one of the things that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does is it restores Section 5 to give the federal government the kinds of oversight that they need to prevent discrimination from happening. Because we know with elections, there are no do-overs. You know, once a person is given a provisional ballot and told that that particular, vote will not count, they don't have an opportunity to do a do-over unless they cure that particular ballot, but it becomes a lot more difficult. And the idea is to really make sure that we address the harms before they can occur. Next slide, please. It is important to note that this will be the first election following the 2020 census without the protection of Section 5. And so one of the things that Section 5 also did was it allowed the Department of Justice to look at how maps are being drawn to make sure that it didn't dilute Black and Brown voting strength. And this really underscores why the VRA and the restoration and federal oversight is so critically important. In fact, the very question about the Voting Rights Act's ability to address issues around discriminatory redistricting will be argued in front of the Supreme Court in the Merrill versus Mulligan decision tomorrow, actually. And so that particular decision will have numerous consequences, because it not only deals with another key provision of the Voting Rights Act, which is Section 2. Next slide, please. So why voting matters. I think we all here know why it is so important to vote. There are significant consequences when a community is unable to elect a candidate of their choice. It can really result in deprivation of resources, and there are a number of instances that we can point to illustrate that point. Next slide, please. One of the things that what happens when we elect a candidate of our choice, it obviously helps to inform how resources are spent, right? So which communities get resources for schools, for education, for parks and green spaces. I think Mississippi is a good example of why it's important to have elected officials who will look out for your interests. They are now suffering from lack of clean water, jobs, libraries, housing, and police accountability. All of those things are inextricably linked to a community's ability to elect a candidate of their choice who will represent their interests when these critical decisions are being made about not only their future, but also the future of our children. Next slide, please. I just wanted to uplift an example of the importance of voting and having an elected official to represent your interests. I think it's important to note that Louisiana and Mississippi have not elected an African-American to statewide office since Reconstruction. And that really is important because there are decisions that are being made about these communities. When you think of Katrina, when you think of a number of other issues, particularly in Louisiana, one of the ones that I wanted to uplift was the environmental impact of an area in St. John's Parish in Louisiana. And what has happened, this particular area that I'm lifting up is called Cancer Alley. And the reason why it's called Cancer Alley is because there have been numerous people for the last 20 years who have died of cancer. And this particular community has been fighting, relentlessly to try to get a moratorium on industry development in this area. They are breathing in toxins 400 times the legal limit. And they have been working, trying to get the governor, trying to get elected officials and the EPA to do something about their current situation. In fact, there was one gentleman who was been leading this fight who was saying that he lost his mother, his brother, his father, all of his aunts and uncles. He's the last in his family. And he also mentioned just a couple of weeks ago that his nephew, who was only 30 years old, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. So this is a critical issue. The people who live in this area, predominantly African-American, and their residents who who don't have substantial means, and there is an opportunity to really do something, I think, with the ability to elect a candidate of their choice and someone who will actually look out for their interest. And with that, I will turn it over to Danielle to not only talk about what individuals can do, but businesses in particular.
Thank you, LaShawn. Thank you, LaShawn. I just want to underscore LaShawn's point and to use that point to thank B Corp and everyone on this call for the work that you're doing to draw attention and to do the intersectional work of climate justice and of voting rights and racial justice, that these are all so interconnected. I also want to thank so many of the folks on this call, both on the upcoming panel, as well as folks who are listening in, have already played a really critical role in some of the key ways that businesses can advocate for voting rights. So one, just to take a half step back, I think it's really important to acknowledge that business has a really credible voice in America. So it's not just important that you all take action because it's important for everyone to take action. Businesses in particular have the ability and have had in history the ability to help move the needle with our policymakers and with the public and more broadly. So one study that I want to point you all to is the Edelman Trust Survey that happened earlier this year that reflects how Americans trust business and trust their employers more than government, more than civil society. So you all, when you use your voice, Americans listen in a deeper and more trustful way than they do to even, I would argue, credible organizations like the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. You also have incredible reach. So businesses have an incredible ability to share voter education as well as motivational messages of get out the vote. There's also opportunities for you to share critical information about how to vote or how people can see if they're actually registered or if they can vote early or what down ballot offices mean. So really thinking about how companies can use their different platforms to make the franchise more accessible. And then finally, I'll point to an example of, during the 2020 election, many companies here are also members of Civic Alliance. And many of our organizations behind the scenes were putting together clear messaging, and we asked companies to push out messaging to help make sure that during the 2020 elections, the election continued until every vote was counted. There was a real threat. You all may recall that the election was going to end on the same day and that every vote would not be counted, which would have undermined our very democracy. So I just don't want to discount or not underscore enough the fact that that the surround sound around the integrity of our democracy and the importance of voting continues to be very critical. I will also, noting back to LaShawn's talking about the January 6th insurrection, political accountability for corporate spending is also very critical. And I think B Corp members are somewhat unique, but there are still a lot of companies out there that initially rescinded giving to policymakers who were election deniers and have since resumed giving. And so this is an area that we really have to watch, and it's really important that we're not contributing to policymakers that are undermining our very democracy. The third piece or bucket of work that companies have done, and we would encourage them to continue to do, is join time off to vote, or just give your folks time off to vote, ideally paid time off to vote, and encourage folks to volunteer. Whether it's during that election day, we desperately need more poll workers. I'm sure you all have heard of the crisis of how many poll workers, because of the growing threat of violence, and also because of COVID, that a lot of poll workers have been resigning or not returning to their station. So we really need help with poll worker recruitment. And if folks already have the day off for election day, it's all the easier for them to sign up. And then the real hope that LaShawn and I have and the B Corp team have in this presentation is that we'll be able to partner with you all on corporate advocacy. And that could include helping with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which will hopefully be reintroduced in the new Congress in 2023. But also we need you all to be whistleblowers and to help on the state level, i.e., policies that passed in Georgia this past year were incredibly painful and are debilitating many people's ability to vote. And so at the state level, the more that we can get companies engaged, the better. And we're excited to come back to this group and to explore ways that we can partner or at least equip you all with the tools to be better advocates in 2023. And with that, I'll share a little bit about some of the ACLU's resources. So very quickly, because we'll send this all to you over an email, but in case you're interested in reaching out to your audiences, giving them voter education information, the ACLU has a comprehensive resource that we're putting out that will, one, make sure that people know how to make a plan to vote, that they'll know their rights when they're voting, and knowing that there's increasing voter intimidation and challenges for people accessing the polls. We want to make sure people know what their rights are. ways for people to take action, inclusive of volunteering to be poll workers in places like Georgia. And then ultimately also helping people to understand, to LaShawn's earlier point, why are down ballot offices important? We often see people voting for their federal, congressional offices or for their gubernatorial race, but not paying as much attention to down ballot races. And we know that reproductive freedom is on the ballot, racial justice is on the ballot, trans rights is on the ballot, children's right to learn and not have their books banned will be on the ballot. And so the ACLU has resources to help educate people on why those down ballot offices are important for the values people care about. And I want to point to you, LaShawn will take it away with some amazing resources from the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Thank you, Danielle. So very much like the ACLU, SPLC has developed a number of resources to help voters navigate a changing landscape. As we talked about during our presentation, the fact that there are so many states that have changed their voting laws, it can often get very confusing. So one of the things that we have done is created state-specific voter guides for the places where we have a presence. And that is intended to help people navigate what has become a more complex landscape in terms of knowing what to do and how, where their polling places are, and if they get a provisional ballot, how to cure it, what the time frame is for which to do that. So those resources are intended to be of help to make it easier for voters to exercise their right to vote. I should also name, in addition to these particular resources, we have a couple of other resources that are really aimed at addressing issues around misinformation and disinformation, so that people will know when they are seeing credible information and when they are receiving information that's meant to deceive them. So we have a number of those resources on our website. Happy to pass that information along to Mari so she can get that out. And I agree completely with Danielle. We really do appreciate B Corp and the partnership and look forward to working with you in the future. Mari.
Thank you so much, Danielle and LaShawn. We also have some amazing B Corps advocating for voting rights joining us today that I would like to introduce. So Sabrina Stratton is Senior Vice President and Northeast Regional Director at Amalgamated Bank. Moroni Mentor is U.S. Activism Manager at Ben & Jerry's, and Liz McGahee is Communications Director for Chicory Wealth. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I'll allow you all to come on to the virtual stage, and I'll jump right into questions. So the first question I have for you all today is, what inspired your organization to get involved in advocating for voting rights?
Great, I'll jump right in. It's great to be with you all today, and certainly appreciate everyone, including LaShawn and Danielle, and their presentation. My name is Sabrina Stratton. I am with Amalgamated Bank, and our organization and our bank is America's socially responsible bank. One of the things mentioned earlier by LaShawn was that everyone deserves a right to have their voices represented in a democratic way, even the most marginalized. Our bank was founded on the premise of providing banking products for the working class. We believe that banks have a very critical role and responsibility to ensure that their voice is advocating for, to use their voice, their money, and their resources to advocate for social justice issues. That's why we are a B Corp bank. That's why we proudly take a stance on issues such as racial justice, climate justice, worker rights, reproductive rights, and voter rights and suppression. So again, we're very excited to be here today and talk a little bit more about some of the work that our bank does.
Thank you. Hi, folks. My name is Moroni. I'm the, as mentioned, the U.S. Activist Manager with Ben & Jerry's. The question was, what inspired Ben & Jerry's to get involved in voting rights? I think it's fair to say that our co-founders, Ben and Jerry's, two white men, live with the guilt of the fact that at the founding of this nation, voting was only limited to white land-owning men. And so they are aware that it was only in recent history that all Black people have had the right to vote. And even that was, and still is, a hard fight. Right. So the Voting Rights Act 1965 put important safeguards in place to protect the rights of Black voters. However, as mentioned, the Voting Rights Act was gutted in the 2013 Supreme Court decisions that basically paved the way for several states to pass voter suppression laws that make it harder for Black people and young people to vote. And the truth is, as a company, Ben & Jerry has a progressive, non-partisan social mission that seeks to meet human needs in our local, national, and international communities by really integrating these concerns in our day-to-day businesses activities. And we believe that democracy only works when it works for everyone. And so, like Republicans, we have known that when young people and people of color use their power and their vote, they can swing elections and elect more diverse leaders. And that's what we'd like to see. And we know that young and Black voters have, again, the power to swing elections when they turn out. And as mentioned already, in 2020, we all know that everything is on the ballot, right? So from reproductive rights, and trans rights to healthcare, criminal justice, voting rights, and so on. So we understand that who we elect will really help decide how and if we tackle these problems. And so it's really important for us to do our part to make sure that people get out and turn out to vote.
Hi there, and thank you. I'm Liz McGahey. I'm the communications director at Chicory Wealth. And Chicory Wealth is a small company. We only have 16 employees. We're all virtual. We're based in Decatur, Georgia, but we're all virtual now. But we feel like we can have a big impact anyway. And our interest in this issue grew out, was just a natural outgrowth of our mission as a company, which is helping people use their resources for social issues that are important to them and investing their money in ethical and socially just ways. And because this is part of our mission, we've never shied away from social engagement on these policies and in our messaging. And certainly a strong democracy and equal access to the political process is absolutely key to every social issue that we've been talking about today. So that's why this is important for us and why we have engaged in it.
Thank you all so much for sharing. My second question for you all is, what programs or initiatives is your company running around voter rights and fighting voter suppression? And what impact are those programs having?
So I'll jump in again. Danielle explained earlier that businesses can help move the needle through voice, giving, and advocacy. When it comes to our voice at Amalgamated Bank, we have done quite a few things. One of them being that we actively take a stand against oppressive statewide voting practices that disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities, and that includes Georgia's voting law. In addition to that, with a lack of progress at the federal level, Amalgamated took action to the states and was the first corporate endorser of Massachusetts Votes Act in 2022. This is now signed into law. We're excited about that, which will expand ballot access in Massachusetts. In the past, we've used our branches as voter registration centers, and every employee has the opportunity to take paid time off to vote. In addition to using our voice, we also use our money to fight voter suppression. One of the programs that we have at our bank is called Donate the Change. It allows our consumer base to round up their debit card purchases and donate to certain socially responsible organizations. Voter rights advocacy groups such as Rock the Vote has participated in this in the past with us, and our consumers were able to donate and round up their purchases and donate directly to Rock the Vote. Another thing that's important to mention is that we do not support political candidates that support voter suppression. We have a very strict policy on that. In addition, with respect to advocacy, we advocated for HR 1, which addresses voter access, election integrity, and campaign finance and ethics. We have partnered with When We All Vote to help build an informed and engaged electorate today and in the future. And in addition to that, as mentioned earlier, we understand how critical, again, it is to have everyone's voices represented in a democratic way. For that reason, we support the reinstatement of voting rights for formerly incarcerated individuals. Those are just some of the things that we do. Again, we firmly believe at Amalgamated Bank that for-profit entities, financial institutions have a critical role in ensuring that there are equal rights for all. And we do believe that using our voice to do so can make a big impact.
So at Ben & Jerry's, in addition to also working with our partners such as the ACLU and others, we are advocating for policies that will encourage more voter participation and turnout. But specifically for this year, this election year, we are engaging both nationally through digital channels, but also in some local communities to promote voter turnout and provide support for policies and policymakers that will seek to protect the values that we as a company care about. A key state in these efforts, as was already mentioned, is Georgia, right? So where our focus has been on engaging with and turning out low propensity voters in the greater area, Atlanta area. So in partnership with Black Voters Matter, we have our ice cream tour bus that's right with our message that says democracy is online, vote like it depends on it. And so with Black Voters Matter, we are visiting HBCUs, big cities and rural communities, serving up free ice cream of Change is Brewing. The tour, this is part of our 7-week tour, which is part of a larger campaign that uses digital and social media channels, radio, newspaper, and outdoor advertising to, again, encourage participation and connect people to the Ben & Jerry's Voter Resources Center, which is basically a tool that allows voters to check their voter registration status, register to vote, and find their polling place, as well as identifying key election-related dates. So, as we saw in Georgia, Senate runoff last year, margins of victory are incredibly narrow, right? Which shows how every vote matters and every vote counts and can make a difference. The outcome in Georgia basically determine who controls the Senate, right? And so, as Danielle mentioned, and it's not just the top of the ticket, House, Senate, or governor races that matter. While those are important, and in many cases, down ballot races for state legislature or prosecutors have an outsized impact on people in communities of color. And so, again, as a company, we too are putting our resources, working with partners to make sure that what we saw in 2020 can repeat itself in terms of the turnout among Black voters, even though there are these laws being passed to make it harder for folks who look like me to vote. But as a company, we are doing our part to continue to fight these voter suppression laws.
Thank you. And I'll mention just a few things. I know we're getting toward the end of time that we do as a company to respond to this issue. One is we partner with other organizations. We mentioned Civic Alliance. This is an organization that we've joined, which is a free organization. They have a lot of great resources and tools about voting and participating in the process. So we're a member of that. And we also are a member of the American Sustainable Business Network. And that is a fee organization, but they have a lot of working groups working on policy, including they have a democracy and voting rights working group. And of course, being part of B Corp, that's a great resource as well that we take advantage of. The second issue is employee policies, which some of you have mentioned. We do allow time off and we don't just allow time off for voting, we encourage time off, paid time off. And for working the polls, as Danielle mentioned, the need for poll workers is very, very important. So we do give our employees time off for that. Another thing I want to mention that we do, because we manage our own portfolio and screen all our companies that we invest in to make sure they're as ethical as possible on such criteria as the environment, governance, and social justice. Because of this, many of our clients participate in shareholder activism, which is another way to have an impact. And we can vote proxy for them on shareholder resolutions that can really make a difference at the corporate level. And the final thing, as everyone has mentioned, is just public messaging about these issues on voting and voting rights. I know some businesses might be squeamish about that, but that is something that has really been part of our public messaging since we started. We've written blog posts on issues like women's reproductive rights, racial justice, alternative energies, and so on. And of course, voting rights and participation in the democratic process is a very, very important part of that. So it's definitely part of our public messaging. And I think our clients like that. I mean, I know they like it. They like that we're very clear about where we stand and what we support. So that's been a positive thing for us as a business.
Thank you all for sharing. And as we wrap up for today, if you could give one piece of advice to businesses interested in activating around this topic, what would you say?
I would say align your dollars with your values. Look at, as Liz mentioned, who you partner with, who you bank with. What are your partners? What are your banks? What are your vendors doing to advocate for the same causes you are? Because the power comes with numbers. And if we all are moving forward, we can move forward in a more efficient and better way.
I would also say that, I do believe that B Corps and companies in general have a responsibility and a unique opportunity to be a powerful lever of change in the world. I do think that companies can use traditional and modern business tools to drive systemic progressive social change by advancing the strategies of the larger movements that deal with those issues, such as voting rights and social equity. I think for us as a company, a lot of the company want to care about profit, right? And I think at Ben & Jerry, one of the things that we have learned is that even though we are an ice cream company, we do take positions in a lot of these social issues. And what we have learned is that when we take a position, for every 2 customers that we lose, we will gain 10, right? So the idea that if you take a position as a company that will hurt profit, that does not, it hasn't happened. We haven't seen it. In fact, it works best for us. People are buying more ice cream. As I mentioned, for every 2 customers that we lose because of a position that we've taken, we are gaining 10. So I encourage other companies to think about doing the same thing.
Yeah, and that's basically what I was going to say too. I would encourage people, people who are part of companies, no matter how small, you can make a difference and have a ripple effect And we also, I would say, don't be afraid to make a stand, as you were saying, Roni. And there are probably people who have looked at our website and said, oh, they're not for me. I don't like where they're going. But I can say for sure that our clients love that we stand up for what we believe in, and they want to be part of that. And so, and of course, it's just the right thing to do. So we're glad to be a part of that.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for joining today. It was so insightful and very powerful to end today's session with B Corp sharing what they're doing around voting rights. As we close out, there's just a few more things that we will share with folks and how you can move forward around voting rights. So 4 things that businesses can do. 1, encourage employees to participate civically. 2, amplify voter education and voting rights messaging. 3, advocate at the federal and state level to increase access to the ballot. And 4, build private sector's commitment to voting rights. If you weren't able to capture all of the information provided today, do not worry about it. After this session, and we can move to the next slide, this recording will be emailed to everyone that registered. You can check out our voting rights landing page that was dropped in the chat today. We also will have that in the follow-up email. We'll have materials provided by ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center in that email as well, and an opportunity to activate with We the Change. And we also have future opportunities to continue to engage with ACLU and SBLC. So you can look in that email for some of those opportunities and further correspondence around those chances to continue to work. Thank you for everyone for joining today, to our panelists, our speakers, and the staff behind the scenes that helped to make today possible. And also thank you to all of you for joining and those that will be watching the recording. Have a great week.